What is up, guys? Today we are going to be talking about the design of your van layout in my new favorite tool, OnShape. I encourage anybody who is going to go out and build a van to spend hours in a tool like this, designing at least a rough, boxy version of the van layout. You will save a ton of money, a ton of frustration by just doing it in a three-dimensional simulation before doing it in real life. I know it's a little bit rare. I'm coming at you a little bit cleaner today, a little less dirt on the face because I am not in the workshop building the van. This right here is the current version of my newest van layout, the E350 that we are doing on this channel. But this particular video is not going to be talking about my layout. This video is going to teach you the bare basics on how to create your van layout. First part of the video, I'm going to talk about why OnShape and why this is my new favorite tool for designing vans. And then we are going to get into the tutorial section where I have basically stripped down all of the complexity from OnShape into only a couple of different tools that you'll need in order to actually achieve an entire van layout. Okay, so part one of the video, why I think OnShape is the new best tool to design your van layout. I've had this channel for, I don't even know now, 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. In the last couple of vans that we've built, I've shown you how to design your van layout in a tool called SketchUp, which is a very similar tool to OnShape. And I used to think it was the best for designing these van layouts. And actually, when I first started getting into the design for this particular van layout, I first started by going to SketchUp since that was the tool I knew and loved. And I tried to get started, but it turns out that since I've used SketchUp the last time, which was about 3 years ago, a ton of stuff has changed. It's like kind of free, kind of not free now. There's tons of upsells in the product. They've completely changed the UI. And within about 5 minutes, I realized, okay, this is no longer the tool that I want to use for my van layouts. And it turns out I actually already knew OnShape because I was forced to learn it when I was designing and 3D printing my first van product that I sell on my website. This thing called an extendo vent that lets you basically attach it to a diesel heater, pull the vent out of the wall so you can put the heat anywhere you want in the van. Anyways, that's a completely different series. In the form that I'm going to teach you guys, it's incredibly simple. This tool gets ridiculously complex very, very quickly, but I'm going to show you guys about 1% of the total functionality of the tool, which is all you need to design your van. And therefore, I think it's really simple. And then the next reason, which I think is the really, really big reason why I'm gravitating towards OnShape for designing my van and why I think it's the best for most people, is it gives you a ton of control over the design that you have. What I mean by that is in SketchUp, especially on the tutorials that I taught you guys previously, you'd sometimes get into the state where you just lose control of your design. Like certain objects would bind to other objects and then you couldn't really do anything from there unless you just dragged your mouse over a huge swath of design, press delete and start it over. OnShape forces you to be a lot more deliberate. You rarely get into a state where you've lost control of the design because each step was deliberately taken and shows up on the left-hand side. Next reason why I think this tool is great is not only can you design your van, but you can graduate from designing your van into designing real engineered parts for a 3D printer. That might sound crazy to you. You might think, oh, I'm never going to get into 3D printing. In this day and age, 3D printing is getting more popular. It's actually incredibly useful for just designing little one-off parts for your van build. And if you start by learning OnShape right now, it's going to be way easier for you to design and print your own 3D parts if you ever decide to do that in the future. And then last reason is kind of a bonus, but they do have a great mobile app, which is also free. I've been known to pull that up when I'm on a dinner date with my girlfriend and start blabbing about the van build and all the different things that I've thought about. And that may or may not be her least favorite feature of OnShape, but I think it's really cool to just have the rendered 3D design on your phone so you can pull it up and look at it if you're kind of in that headspace and you want to think about a trade-off or make a different design decision. So that covers the initial blab session and why I think OnShape is now the best tool to use. Let's go ahead and dive into the actual tutorial here. Okay, so we're gonna start from a completely clean shape. I'm gonna go back to my OnShape home screen. This is where you're gonna get dropped into the moment after you create your free account. You're gonna go to the Create button on the top left. You're gonna go to Document. We can just call it Tutorial. Create Public Document. Oh, I do wanna make sure that our document here is in inches and not millimeters. I work in millimeters when I'm designing small parts and I work in inches when I'm designing big stuff. So to do that, I think we come up here, we go to workspace units, and what do you know? It's in millimeters, so change it to inches. So before we start actually designing anything, there's two functions that you're really gonna need throughout the entirety of actually building stuff. First one is being able to rotate the screen that you're looking at, which you do by just holding the right mouse button, this one right here. Hold it down, drag your mouse around, you can rotate the design. You can also use this little widget up here to do rotation of the view you're looking at. And if you click on a particular surface here, like top, it will rotate the view to look at that particular surface. Next thing we're gonna do is pan, which is different than rotate. This one's rotate, this one's pan. You can pan your drawing by clicking down on the scroll wheel of your mouse in the middle of your mouse and dragging your mouse around, just like that. So the first mission that we have is to create the floor of the van. But in order to do that, I need to take a step back and teach you guys the first tool, which is kind of the core foundational tool to OnShape. That is called the sketch tool. The best way I like to think about it is it's basically just a piece of paper. And as with a piece of paper, you can draw any two-dimensional shape on it. You can use the sketch tool by pressing this button on the top left here, and you have to assign the sketch to sit on a particular plane. So let's select the top plane. And at this point, you can draw any two-dimensional shape on this sketch, just like this. Then you can apply different operations to these two-dimensional shapes, such as an extrude, to eventually create three-dimensional parts. And the reason that you have to start with a sketch and a two-dimensional shape in any real CAD tool, such as OnShape, is because it just forces you to take each step explicitly. It gives you a lot more fine-grained control and ability to go back and change things while leaving the entire design to exact specifications. I know it took me a while to understand what a sketch is and why you draw your two-dimensional stuff on there first. I think it'll make more sense as we progress through the video. So we have our first sketch. Let's go back to the top perspective here. Now, if we want to create the most basic version of our van floor, we need to first go get the dimensions of our van floor. If you're working with a modern van, like a Sprinter van, the dimensions for your particular van are readily available on a ton of different places. For us, with our E350 van, I had to go out there and use a measuring tape because, believe it or not, I had trouble trying to find the dimensions of the floor and the ceiling space on the internet. You can see here, I took a ton of measurements on my phone. Hopefully that's clear enough on the screen to actually see. But I just went in there, went buck wild with my tape measure and got as many different measurements as I could get. And we are now going to create a rectangle that represents the floor of our van on this sketch. So we're going to draw a rectangle on the piece of paper, is how I like to think about it. You have to have the sketch open so that we can draw this rectangle within the sketch. Then you'll see this rectangle tool. Click center point rectangle. Click the origin. You'll see it highlight orange when you have it fully selected here. The origin is just the very center of this entire three-dimensional space. If you click the origin, it sticks the center of our rectangle to the center of space, and you can just create a rectangle. There's a couple of ways to basically assign the dimensions that we've measured to the rectangle. We haven't done anything after we created the rectangle here, so you can see the dimensions are highlighted. If you press 0, it'll let you modify that text field. Don't ask me why you have to press 0 first, but that's just what you have to do so that you can edit the number here. Our cargo length is 116 inches. Oh, shoot, that was width. Let me redo that real quick. Center point rectangle, click origin, drag it out. Now we're on length, 116 inches long, and then 71 inches wide. So this is our cargo area. If we click the check mark here, that basically just says we're good for now, but you can always go back into this sketch. You can change the dimensions, which is really nice when we start moving stuff around. So now we have our two-dimensional floor in sketch 1. We can right click it, rename it, call it floor. We have our floor. Now we want to create a galley unit on top of the floor. What do we do when we want to design things on a two-dimensional piece of paper? We create a sketch. We need that sketch to exist on a plane. This time, we want that to be the plane of the floor itself. So we clicked on the floor rectangle that we just drew. We can create our rectangle, which will represent the galley unit. Let's go ahead and do a corner rectangle for this one. Now, if we basically hover over one of these lines on the floor that we just created, you can see it turns yellow. That means that the rectangle that we're creating is going to be bound to that line, which is what we want in the case of the galley unit, since we want it up against the wall. So I'm hovering over this line, I'm clicking, and I can drag this corner rectangle out. Let's drag it to about there. And the dimensions of the galley unit that we want to create for this tutorial, it's going to be 60 inches long, 20 inches wide. This is a small van. You'd make a bigger one in a Sprinter van, but in this E350, our galley unit needs to be teeny tiny. If we press check, we'll rename this one to galley unit. We have two pieces of paper laid directly on top of each other, one of which has the floor and the next one has the galley in it. If I kind of hover around, I can hover these shapes individually, which is going to lead us into the next tool, going from two-dimensional space to three-dimensional space. The way that we're going to do it, and that you can use to design 99% of your van, is going to be the extrude tool. The extrude tool takes a two-dimensional shape that you've drawn on a sketch and extrudes it into the third dimension. So we can click the extrude tool. We can click on the galley unit that we just drew. Let's see if we can get a good selection here. See, it's selecting different things as I hover around. We want to have it so that the box or rectangle that we just drew highlights in yellow. I'm going to click that. And you can see that it's now starting to extrude into three-dimensional space. They give you a bunch of different options here. We're not going to change any of those options except for the actual depth, which in our case is going to correspond to the height that we want the galley unit to be. 26 inches. This is also the galley unit. I'm just also going to call it galley unit. You could call this galley unit extrude and call this one galley unit sketch, but I just prefer to have them all called galley unit, and then I'll just kind of, I get used to what these icons mean, and I can find the sketch or the extrude depending on what I'm looking for. Okay, so the next task that we have is to add a sink to our galley unit. That's going to work very similarly to how we just created the galley unit on the floor. The only difference is, let's create a new sketch by clicking the button here. The plane that we want this sketch or two-dimensional version of the sink to exist on is the top of the galley unit. And we're focusing on keeping everything in the shape of a box because honestly, that's the best way to do a simple version of your first van layout. Make sure you still have your sketch open, click the rectangle tool, and we can draw a rough rectangle. The particular sink that I'm using, I'm going to link that in the future build videos, but it happens to be 18 inches by 18 inches. You can see that it kind of centered itself perfectly on the galley unit, which is ideal. Let's say that this rectangle got created in a bad spot, so I'm going to delete it, recreate it over here, where we know it's not going to be where we want it. 18 by 18 inches. In order to move this square to the right place on the countertop, you want to highlight it. Then you want to press the drop down on this tool right here. Click the drop down, and you want to select the transform tool. Then these little handles are going to appear on the two-dimensional shape that we just created. There's a few different options here. You can move it in one direction. This will force you just to go up and down. You can move it in the other direction. You can force it to move just left and right. You can drag this square here, which lets you move it in both X and Y directions. And it's kind of hard to tell exactly where we are. So let's click the top perspective so that we can look exactly how this thing is relative to the galley unit. Let's put our sink over here where a lot of people decide to put their sinks. It has a little mouse icon with the green check mark on the top left button of the mouse. So I'm going to click, and that effectively moves our sink on this sketch plane to a new place. Let's go ahead and say we're good. Let's rename this to sink. And in the same way that we created the galley unit, let's extrude the sink so that we have a three-dimensional object. It's going this way. We want it to go down into the galley unit. So we're going to click this arrow. This is opposite direction. Something a little bit complex here. When you're doing extrusions, you can do all sorts of different types of extrusions. We want to make sure that every single time we're doing an extrusion, it has the new selected. That is going to create a new object out of the extrusion. and allow us to kind of change this sink independent of any of the other objects that we've created. Anyways, make sure the new tab is selected. I believe my sink is 9 inches deep. So let's do 9 inches of depth and we'll press done. And at this point, you might be like, okay, I'm very confused. Where did the sink go? I can only kind of see it at the top of this counter. Well, you can see in the bottom left here, we just click this little eye and it will hide and unhide, which doesn't change any of the engineering here. It's just like a visual hide and unhide. It's not deleting anything. You can also do my favorite thing to do, which is right click it and make transparent. Making it transparent is pretty much the same thing as hiding it, but you can kind of see the outline of it so that you can see how big it is relative to, let's say, our sink, which is different than the top left. The top left list of items here is our timeline of operations that we've done in this document. So the very first thing we did, the floor, is always going to stay at the very top here. It's the first operation that we did. Then we did the sketch for the galley unit, the extrusion for the galley unit, the sketch for the sink, and the extrusion for the sink. As you create more steps, they will automatically grow from the bottom here. And in our very simple use case, we're not going to be dragging these things around or changing the order of things. You can just always create new sketches and new extrusions, and it's okay that they fall at the bottom. So now let's go ahead and add a fridge to our galley unit. Let's go ahead and create the sketch. We're going to draw a rectangle, 24 inch wide. For simplicity's sake, let's just call it 20 inches deep. Extrude. Make sure to press new. Call it 22 inches tall. Our fridge. And as you guys can see, we're really just doing the sketch, draw a rectangle, extrude that rectangle for every single component inside the van. For the next lesson here, I'm going to explain a feature of OnShape that you're going to need a lot as you're designing your van build. And that feature is determining the distance between 2 points or 2 lines. In OnShape, this is very, very simple. You just click line number 1 and you click line number 2. And in the bottom right-hand side of the SketchUp interface, it shows you how much distance is in between those 2 parts. If you select a bunch of things and you want to get the things deselected, you've got to find an open space that has nothing behind it and click that. That is the only way to deselect your selection. So if you've measured something and you've realized, I want this to be a different distance, I will show you guys how to do that right now. Anytime you need to change something, the first way you want to think about doing that is by going back into the original sketch. So if we want to change the distance this sink sits inside of this cabinet, let's go back into the sink sketch. So I've already taught you guys the transform tool, which allows you to just drag this thing around to have a rough placement of where you want it. But if you want this to be an exact distance from, let's say, the back of this counter, we're going to use what's called the dimension tool. The dimension tool is like this auto magical tool. You can do angles with it. You can do dimensions of a shape. You can do dimensions between shapes. And it's kind of just smart. So the way that it works is you just click the things that you want to apply a dimension to. In this case, click this line, which is the back edge of the sink. And we click this line, which is the back edge of the counter. And that gives us a number that we can enter here. Let's call it 1.5 inches. If we enter that, it perfectly places the sink 1.5 inches from the back of the counter. The challenging part about the dimension tool is this is going to bring us into the world of what are called constraints. So each one of these dimensions is a constraint on this particular sketch, but there's lots of other ways to provide constraints as well. And what you often run into is a much more advanced topic. Let's say we put a second dimension between the sink and the counter and we call it 1.6 inches. The sketch fails to resolve and you can't move forward. If your sketch does turn red like this, you basically have to delete constraints until it can resolve itself. And if you can't delete the constraints so that it can't resolve itself, which does sometimes happen just due to the nature of how complex this is, thankfully, I've taught you how to keep these sketches very simple. Just delete this singular sketch and recreate it. Very last tool that I want to teach you guys is somewhat similar to the dimension tool. When you add a dimension, it creates a constraint for that particular portion of the sketch. We're also going to teach you guys a new tool to create another type of constraint on the sketch that happens to be very useful when you're designing a van layout. That is the coincident constraint. So we still have the sink sketch open here. Let's say we really wanted the edge of the sink to align exactly with the edge of the countertop. You might think it's easiest to do what I taught you guys earlier and highlight the rectangle, use the transform tool, and then go like this. That's not a terrible way to do it, but you're never gonna get this exactly on this line. If you want this edge to line up exactly with this edge, you take what's called the coincident tool. It's right next to the dimension tool. I'm sure there's a good scientific explanation for how this coincident tool works, but in my mind, the coincident tool allows you to click two things and they just like stick to each other exactly. You can do coincident with points. You can do coincident with lines. In this case, let's do a coincident with a line. So let's say we want to align this edge of the sink with this edge of the countertop. We can use the coincident tool to do that by clicking the coincident tool to activate it, hovering over the edge of the sink, flicking the edge of the sink, it turns extra yellow, and then we're hovering over the edge of the countertop, flicking the edge of the countertop. You can see the sink moved so that it perfectly lines up with the edge of the countertop here. So now if we press the check mark on this sketch, that extrude that we applied to the sink sketch has followed it, and we've effectively moved the sink. So that was my version of trying to teach you guys the absolute basics of OnShape. I will put links to this tutorial document as well as a link to my E350 design so that you guys can go look at those documents, import them into your own workspace and play around with them to maybe try and learn from a specific example. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you do want to see us turn this SketchUp design into reality in our van outside, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be documenting the entire build series. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.